Thank you very much for coming on Just Get a Real Job. It's evening where I am in the UK, but I believe that it's still morning over in LA, isn't it? So good morning to
Still
you.
morning. Thank you. Good morning. Good evening. It's still just about morning. It's 11. It's just after 11 o'clock here.
Yeah, it's interesting trying to work the time difference out. I thought to sort of start off, I wanted to ask, just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background. You currently work for Two Daughters Entertainment in the animation sort of space. You do a lot of work in scripted and in the American market, and you also sort of used to work for the British government in America as well. So could you sort of introduce yourself, give us a brief overview into who you are and your career and stuff?
I'll do my best. It's not the most intuitive path. My training is in international affairs and international relations. That's what I have a degree in. That's what I went to school for. My first job was in Washington, D.C., working for the U.S. government in international trade policy. I was always sort of pulled to the creative industries, though, on the side. I started out managing a band, and I founded a film criticism website, and eventually decided to make the move out to Los Angeles to get a full-time job in the creative industries, which I did for a time in the video on demand space with a company called Cinema Now, doing business development. They were a startup, majority owned by Lionsgate Entertainment. In fact, that's where our office was. The problem was that this was about 7 or 8 years before Netflix blew up. Netflix did already exist as a sort of a DVD by mail service, but we were very early stage. I think a quarter of our audience was streaming films on 56K dial-up modems. So you can imagine that wasn't the best user experience. That being said, the company did okay, but they had to make cuts as companies often do. On the side, I went through the UCLA screenwriting program, and eventually all this culminated together into a job at the British consulate, creating and building a new portfolio of work, which was focusing on the creative and media industries. So essentially, it was business development for Britain. So I did that for many years, running the U.S. strategy for the UK, supporting UK exporters and doing business in the United States, attracting investment into the UK. And after some years, I managed the entire business development team, which took me a little bit further away from the creative industries because we were already also doing life sciences and engineering and what have you, but still with the creative industries as an important focus because this is the global hub for them. There were cuts at the consulate, layoffs again. Layoffs are a constant here in LA. And last year I left the consulate, and after a few months found myself working for Two Daughters Entertainment as their VP of US operations. And that's been a lot of fun. I haven't been there for very, very long, but it's been a lot of fun working for an animation studio and helping them to develop business in the United States.
I think something we'll talk a lot about tonight. Thank you for sharing your careers, because I know we're covering a lot of things very succinctly. But something I kind of want to talk to you a lot about tonight is business and how it ties in with the creative arts, because I think there's a big push at the moment that a lot of creative people keep getting told you need to be more entrepreneurial, you need to be more business minded to make it as an artist. Firstly, what is your opinion on that? Do you sometimes think we should let the creatives just be creative, or do you think it's quite useful to be business minded if you're creative? Because I think a lot of our listeners will I've heard a lot of this recently.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts about that, and I'll attempt to present them coherently. I do think that it's an important subject that you bring up. I don't think that you can be successful in the creative industries as a creative if you don't at least have some cursory understanding of business drivers and motivations. Similarly, I think on the business side of the creative industries, sometimes they fall into a trap of considering the creative as just another ingredient or step in the production process, which is not how creativity works. I think we all know, I'm sure most of your listeners would agree. It's not something you can quantify. It's not something you can de-risk. There's an art to it. There's a magic to it. Whether something works or not is something, there's algorithms that can predict whether or not, the latest Transformer movie will be financially successful, but there's not an algorithm, I think, that can help you make a judgment call about the quality of a script or a pitch in terms of its potential to actually connect with audiences. And maybe there were people that would disagree with me, but I think that ultimately you have to hold space for that, and you have to understand creativity enough to work with it. So it's an important subject that you bring up. If you want to talk about what creatives need to understand or need to do to better work with the business side of things, the first thing that I would say is that you have to know how to talk about what you do. It's the same thing if you're creating a piece of content, if you're writing something or directing something, you want to connect with an audience, right? And so you tell a story that you think will do that. And when something isn't landing, and you read pages of a screenplay and you can tell if there isn't something that an audience can hook onto, and you work on those things. Well, it's the same thing on the business side. You have to be able to pitch yourself. You have to be able to pitch your story, pitch your project, pitch your talents, whatever it might be. You have to be able to talk about them succinctly, in a way that people connect with, and in a way that they can understand. And you always have to bear in mind, why should they care? And the answer to that isn't simply because I'm passionate about it, although passion does translate when you're pitching anything, right? But it can't just be, I love it, so I'm just going to tell you how much I love it. You have to think about what it is that they're motivated by, struggling with, what drivers might factor into whether or not they're going to make time for you, and pitch to that. And that sounds difficult, and it is, but if you have a story or a project, you're the person that knows it best. And if you can't summarize it succinctly in 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, compellingly, then that's a gap. So that's important. I think knowing how to talk about your project is important.
For sure. I think it's an interest. It just seems to be quite a common thing that's coming up a lot at the moment, that I'm hearing in, just online or around the creative industries, is that because of the way that the world is changing and the way that social media is changing and stuff, it's kind of disrupted a lot of the way creatives maybe would work, or the careers that they would have in the past, where it's now much more non-linear than it ever was, and that often creative people have to completely transition into a different type of, say you're a writer, you maybe have to move into a slightly different space or whatever it is, and it's having that sort of business mindset that might be quite useful. And I think pitching is obviously a big part of that, but it's complicated, and I suppose it's always been non-linear as well.
I think that's right. I mentioned earlier about the business side of things is always trying to de-risk the gambles that they take on creative projects, right? So when you're talking about content, film, music, television, whatever it might be, one of the things that they look for in their efforts to de-risk the gambles they take is a built-in audience. So I'm sure that you've heard all about, existing IPs, sequels, remakes, things based on a best-selling book that already exists, and so forth. And so now downstream of that, that's tended to be translated into, I'll be more interested in your project. Your project is great, but I'll be more interested in it if you have 1 million followers on TikTok already, or there's an audiobook that's done really well already. So I think there might be a built-in audience that it gives me a hook in which to sell and market it. So that helps get me closer to gambling the money that you need to make this thing. And we are oftentimes talking about huge quantities of money. So the effort to de-risk the gamble is something that creatives need to understand, and I guess need to factor in. And maybe there's things that you can do even if your idea is completely fresh and new and has nothing to do with anything that's come before. If you have a novel of it, if you have a really well thought out pitch deck, that contemplates what some of the ancillary ways that it can exist, what a video game might look like, what the merchandising might look like, all of those things will help communicate the potential of your project to a business person.
Is there anything that business could learn from the creative industries on the flip side? Because you're obviously a very creative person, but you've obviously worked a lot on the business side as well. Did you ever look across your colleagues frustrated going, if you were more open-minded creatively, this would probably benefit us on the complete flip side of that?
I have been surprised. I'm still surprised today, even though I shouldn't be, at the amount of content that gets bought, sold, greenlit, and significantly down the road before there's even a good script. And this is in film and television, obviously. I through my PageCraft business, which we haven't talked about yet, but I'm sure we'll get to, I believe firmly that without a great script, you don't have a piece of TV or film content. So, sometimes getting a good script does require a financial investment. You have to commit some money before you have that, and you're not going to commit the money if you don't think that the idea is good. I get that. But an idea is not the same thing as having a script that you believe in. There are plenty of ideas. In fact, you can't even, in the United States, you can't even copyright an idea. It has to be more developed than that, and it has to exist in a tangible medium on top of that. We don't have to talk about IP law, but I think that the reason you see a lot of mediocre content is because the train was already in motion before you had a script, and by the time you have a script that doesn't work, you've already committed to delivering this content to certain markets on a certain timeline, and you know what? It's not good, but we're going to have to finish it and deliver it, and that's what happens. And that, to me, is, I understand why it happens, but it always feels a little bit backwards to me. And if I could wave a magic wand, that would be the one thing I would change about the industry. Start with the script.
We spoke a little bit of this we spoke a little bit about this last night, actually. It's particularly maybe an interest for the listeners to talk about a call we had that we're not recording, but we were discussing some of the problems facing the TV industry and the media industry, both in the US and in the UK. And one of the things we discussed was that budgets have gotten so big that shows require so much money to make, and that's part of the issue, that we're not making enough lower budget stuff as a result, and it's just costing so much that it's squeezing a lot of people out. That's probably part of that issue as well, that all these mediocre scripts have to be made because they've already been paid for, and it requires these huge budgets for not actually a great return.
Yeah, if you're making something, even a small budget, right? What's a small budget these days? Even $20 or $30 million is considered a small budget. That's a massive amount of money to anybody, right? So nobody can afford to just lose that amount of money. Well, maybe there's some billionaires that can, but nobody can afford to lose that amount of money. So that's how stuff gets completed and delivered, even though it might not be good, might not be ready, or a year of extra development would have made it into something good. There's plenty of bad content that is made out of great scripts too, and sometimes things go wrong. But I do agree with the idea that production budgets have in general gotten too big. Right now, the example that everyone's talking about is the Electric State on Netflix, which allegedly cost $320 million to make. I don't know if that includes P&A or not. Even if it does include P&A, that is a massive, massive quantity of money to spend on a film that I'm going to reserve my personal comment on it, but certainly the reviews have been dreadful. So how does a movie that costs that amount of money with dreadful reviews, almost universally dreadful, get made? It's because of the dynamic that I just talked about, but even so, it still feels like a bit of a mystery. I do think production budgets are too high. I think that incentives in various markets, like the UK, like the state of Georgia, like many of the Canadian provinces and other parts of the world, are helping to support these very large budgets, because you can get 20, 30, even 40% of your money back in these places. And I don't criticize these jurisdictions for offering tax incentives, because I think there is a cultural value and a value to developing skills and creativity that is a hidden benefit of those incentives. But at the same time, if you remove those incentives, I think the production market would quickly fall apart. So I think that productions just have to be leaner. And I know that's an easy thing to say, but when you see what some of the studio overheads are, and you see what some of the talent salaries are, and you start thinking about that, it's easy to see where some cuts could be made. And I don't think a lot of the studio heads like to blame the guilds for escalating costs, but I don't think that's where the majority of the problem lies.
No, not at all. And often a lot of writers and people in the crew are actually the ones that are probably being underpaid, and the money's been arguably wasted in other areas more.
Yeah, but this is also where creatives can help. I think that if you're writing a script, you have to write the best version of the script possible. You don't start making production decisions before you've completed a brilliant script. But once you've completed the brilliant script, then you can start looking at what compromises you can make to reduce costs without compromising the overall vision of the project. And you have famous stories of directors like Francis Ford Coppola, who have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to shoot in a particular place or to get a particular shot in exactly the way they wanted. And those are expenses that on the creative side, creatives need to understand you just can't do that. And then on the business side, there's a lot of waste too, I think.
And there's lots of great examples in film and TV, in Hollywood, in the UK, everywhere, of like great stuff that was made on a lower budget and a leaner budget, and it's still successful and commercially successful. So it's definitely achievable.
I'd agree with that. There are countless examples, and even today, there are countless of examples. And sometimes the most successful films are the ones that are based on completely new IP as well, which I think production decision makers need to remember. If you only ever make sequels and remakes, then you run out of content pretty quickly at some point. You need the industry does need those fresh ideas, and oftentimes, because they're seen as bigger gambles, they are made for lower production budgets.
Yeah, for sure. It does feel very risk averse at the moment. I want to also ask you about the differences between the UK and the US. Obviously, you work for the UK government and try and bring investment into the UK and things like that. And obviously, you live in America, work in America. Are there any differences in terms of opportunities, in terms of the media landscape there, in positive or negative senses, or do you think there's a lot of overlap as well?
Probably more similarities than there are differences. But if you want to talk a little bit about the differences, I mean, look, the differences, I think they're probably fairly obvious, but just to run through them really quickly, I mean, there's the scale of the marketplace, obviously, and the scale of financial backing that you can get as a result of it is a huge difference. The US market is, what is the United States? About 5 times as many people as the United Kingdom. So that means a huge amount of difference in terms of people competing for attention, people competing to get their projects made, and the size of audiences and the size of money that's available. So that's obviously a huge difference. The second thing that I would say is in the United States, there's really very little place for public money and public sector institutions in the market. The UK still has a pretty strong role, public sector role in the creative marketplace through the BBC, but also through different development funds that you can access, skill set, the screen agencies in various countries and regions, that sort of thing. So I have British friends who often bemoan that there isn't more of that support available, but it's certainly more than is available in the United States from public money. I forgot to mention the British Film Institute. And then the third is how the market is segmented. I think the U.S. is it is a very segmented marketplace, and these days with streaming, it's even more segmented. But it's not segmented regionally. It is segmented based on kind of the cultural backgrounds of different audiences, in some cases the political background of audiences. So it's sort of like it's a national marketplace, but it's segmented based on other factors. Whereas in the UK, there's still regional marketplaces like Scotland. There's Welsh language content. There's Gaelic content, for example, and content that's made in particular parts of the UK using particular funding that exists only in those parts of the UK, and you don't have so much of that in the United States. So those are the big differences. I think what all of that means ultimately, and this is true, it's true in any industry sector, is that there's just a lot of more competition in the United States. And so it becomes more challenging in the United States, and I'm not saying it isn't challenging in the UK, because I know that it is, but it's more challenging in the United States to get noticed, to sell your project, to meet the people that you need to meet. But the principles for doing those things are the same. You have to have quality ideas. You have to be able to communicate those quality ideas effectively, to the point about pitching that I was making earlier. And you, like everything else, it's relationship based, a lot of it. And you have to build your personal network, and you have to meet the right people. And even if you only ever meet other writers, that's helpful, because there's a great writing community here in LA, and a great directors community of people that just, support each other, and then will make introductions for one another. And then when one of them is successful, sometimes there's a knock-on effect where they can bring some people along with them. So having a personal network is hugely important. What I think also is that in the United States, people have such limited bandwidth on the business side, and it can come across as rude and off-putting and unresponsive. But if you look at it from their perspective, these are people who are probably getting hundreds, and I mean hundreds, unsolicited inquiries every day from people. And that's not even counting the pitches that they hear at a cocktail reception or whatever it might be. So everybody has their own personal systems in place for how to filter that down to a manageable amount of noise for them to actually filter intelligently and process. And one of the most common filters that people use is a personal referral. So that's why networks are important.
There's lots of it, so much to unpack from all that. It's really interesting. I suppose one thing I want to ask, and again, this could be my own stereotype. I've never been to America, and this is just something I feel like I've heard quite a lot from people. Some guests on the podcast have said this who have been American in the past. Does the sort of American dream and the cultural side of it, the attitude that you can achieve anything, because does that help give people an advantage in America? Because I feel like in the UK, especially where I grew up in Scotland, there's very much this idea of don't get ideas above your station. The whole name of my podcast is Just Get a Real Job. That's been said to me many times in my life. Like, it's not seen as like a viable career to go and be an artist or go and work in the creative industries. Whereas in America, maybe there's more of a dream or a permission to believe you can achieve anything. Is that true, or is that just kind of media nonsense?
I mean, the American dream is part of the foundational mythology of this country, right? So I would say it is a factor, but, and I don't want to be too discouraging, but I'm not sure that the reality always measures up to the ideal. And it can feel like opportunity is difficult in the UK, but I actually see a lot of things that the UK does better than the US. For example, arts education. In the UK, there is not just an investment in arts education at the primary and secondary school level, or I don't know I can't remember how you refer to the school system there, but we call them primary and secondary schools.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
There's a belief, there's a belief in the importance of arts education. Here in the public school system, it's the first funding that gets cut. It's generally unavailable. There's a lot of schools that don't even have them. You only have serious investment and quality arts education in expensive private schools, which then starts creating, a social stratification to people who are getting training in the arts, which is not good. And then in the UK, you have development pots that you can access. You can apply to different bodies to get funds to make your first short film, or write your first screenplay, or whatever it might be. It's not a lot of money, but if you're making a film for £10,000, it's you get a £1,000 or £2,000 grant, it could be the difference, right? So those pots of money don't really. There are some private sector organizations, some competitions, some fellowships that you can get in the United States, but you don't really have public money in that. So the fact that the UK has public money behind those sorts of things, it may not be a lot, but it's more than we have in the United States. Those sorts of programs are programs that help create equality of opportunity in the creative industries. If you don't have those programs, you have a situation where basically only the people who can afford to take risks with their life, or afford to send their kids to expensive private schools that have really quality arts education, or people who are sort of born into creative families, those are the people who tend to get access to the opportunities. And I'm not saying that they're untalented. They're hugely talented people, many of them. But there's also hugely talented people that never get those opportunities because they didn't come from, a family that had the money to kind of create that opportunity for them. And so this isn't universally true. And of course, there are plenty of examples that you can cite of people who came up from the working classes, let's say, and had a successful creative industries career. But I don't think it's the norm.
No, for sure. I think it's at the moment it's an exception, and I think it's really interesting what you said about quality of opportunity and chance for equal opportunity stuff. It's obviously, while the UK does have access to those public funding, as you acknowledged, it's crazy to think that America doesn't have that at all, actually, because it's something that has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed here, and is not in reality now working in the way it should. It's still better than nothing, but it's so interesting how similar both countries sound at the moment in terms of it's now getting to a point where if you don't come from a privileged background and you can't even pay the rent, that's one of the big things to use. Like, so many people in the arts at the moment can't afford to pay the rent. They can't take the risks to go and forge a career and be a full-time creative, and it's not a sustainable career anymore. And I do worry we're at a point now where, obviously, as you mentioned, there's the rare example of people from a working class background that have gone on to make a sustainable, successful career in the creative industries. That is not the norm anymore, and that's going to go down and down and down until I don't know what the solution is. That's maybe my next question for you. I was going to ask about social mobility, how you think we can maybe improve on that in both countries, but is there a way to succeed if you don't come from that background anymore? Because it just doesn't feel like realistically there is at the moment.
At the moment, I would probably share your pessimism, unfortunately, because I think right now, at least in the United States, it would require a little bit of a paradigm shift. I think it requires an understanding that arts as education is as important as STEM, which is what everyone's emphasis is on right now. If you want to create opportunities for people, then you have to have better STEM education. That's the messaging. And that's probably true, but I think you also need better arts education as well. And a lot of the creative industries jobs aren't actually arts jobs as well. There's lawyers, there's MBAs, there's skills like craft skills, craftsman skills as well. Mm-hmm. So there are those opportunities, but ultimately, without the creative component, none of the rest works. And I think there needs to be investment in the creative component.
No, for sure. And I guess just to sort of make a point where I do probably sound quite pessimistic on, I'm sure my listeners on the podcast, some of the episodes we've done recently will probably think the same. But I guess the point I'm at personally is I think it's dangerous to tell people that you can go and achieve great success and like, you know, anything's possible. That is true to an extent, but I don't think I think for the average working class person that wants to work in the creative industries, that's probably not true. And I think being able to make a career where you can afford to pay the rent by being in the creative industries is actually a success as much as, you know, big success at the moment in the arts, because it's generally as hard as it's ever been. So I guess that's what I want to say on that point. But, you know, it's really interesting to sort of get your perspective from across the pond as well. I want to ask you about PageCraft as well, because you've done a lot of work with that business to support emerging writers. And again, these sort of things are really important to address some of the inequalities we've just talked about.
Sure, I'd love to talk about PageCraft a little bit. PageCraft is a screenwriting, teaching, coaching, consulting company that I co-founded with my wife, Heidi. The website, I should give the website, is pagecraftwriting.com. It was born out of my
Link
wife and I
below right now, so click below.
Thank you. It was born out of my wife and I going to UCLA screenwriting program. And I was sitting in a workshop with my instructor, Paul Chitlick, 1 year back in 2007, I think it was. This was a long time ago. And we were going through someone's script and exchanging notes on everyone's pages. And someone said, wouldn't it be fun to do this in Italy? And I said, funnily enough, that's not impossible. My dad's good friend, who unfortunately passed away a couple of weeks ago, owned a villa in Tuscany. And so I got the use of it, and not for free, we had to pay, but you know, everybody pitched in and we did a screenwriting retreat in Italy. And we have been doing those screenwriting retreats in Italy ever since. A few years back, it was just a sideline to do that retreat. So it's kind of fun, but that's all it was for many years. And then a few years back, we said, let's make this a real business. So we started doing LA-based workshops. We did a retreat in Los Angeles. My wife, who has started out reading scripts and later co-founded the Slam Dance script writing clinic, started teaching, and then we started offering workshops, which then became online workshops. And so now we're running a couple of workshops every quarter on Zoom, and you can also get one-to-one feedback and one-to-one coaching. And we're still doing the screenwriting retreats in Italy. In fact, I'll go to Italy at the end of May for that. And we also have a screenwriting retreat in California that we do every year. So what people get out of it, our focus is really on making people better writers, on giving people the tools to succeed as screenwriters. We don't make a lot of promises about, you know, success in the industry. That's not really our core proposition. Our core proposition is we will help you develop your idea. If you already have a script, we will help you make your script better. If we can help people in the industry, we will, but we don't want to make any promises on that front. We know that a lot of our competitors will suggest that they do that sort of thing. I think those promises are sometimes not entirely, there's not a whole lot of follow through on it. So we just want to focus on making people better writers. And we've tried to build a little bit of a community around what we do. We have a lot of returning people who come back for content and for advice again and again. We have an alumna who's won multiple Emmys and is now teaching for us. We have another alumna who won the Unequal Fellowship, which is a big deal in the United States. So we've had success stories. And we're very proud of the work that we do. And it's how I spend most weekends, doing at least a couple workshops with Heidi.
That's really nice as well that you know get to do something like that with your wife. That's great. Thank you for telling us. I kind of want to know, like, obviously it'd be really easy to ask you, like, what advice would you have for writers? But instead, I think a more interesting question is, what's a common thing that you find writers are missing that come to your workshops?
I think given that our focus is really on making the screenplay as good as it can be and helping each individual writer realize the vision that they come in with. We're not here to tell you, oh, don't write that script because that sort of thing isn't selling right now. We're just trying to help you realize your vision as best we can. What we find is usually a script that isn't working on all the levels that it needs to work at. That's oftentimes, and that's kind of a natural process for any writer. Sometimes you come in and you have a clear vision about what the main drivers of the plot need to be, but you have no idea what the emotional life of the script is. And sometimes you know what the emotional journey of your script is, but you haven't really figured out what the story beats are. And getting all of that to work in concert is, I think, the magic of a successful screenplay. When you have kind of the external sort of narrative working in concert with the emotional story, working in concert with the internal growth. That's difficult to achieve, but we have tools that we've developed to help people achieve all those things. And when we break it down into the separate components and apply our tools, it's pretty, I'm not going to say easy, because writing is everyone thinks they can write, but it's one of the hardest things. But it becomes more manageable to kind of identify where the strengths of a project are and where the gaps are, and focus on the gaps. And so that's what we try to do in our workshops.
No, it's really interesting. And as I said before, there's links to PageCraft, and you can find out more about all that in the show notes and below this video. I guess just because you've obviously worked for, in various spaces doing PageCraft and your day job and all that, do you have a sort of idea of what the latest trends or where we may be headed as a media industry? Like, obviously things like AI, it's hard to predict and it's quite scary and stuff, but do you see where we might be headed as an industry in the coming years? Do you have a hunch about that, or an inkling or anything like that?
I mean, I can give you sort of a random grab bag of trends that I see. I am not an AI expert, so I'll limit myself on AI to saying that I don't think it's going away. I share people's concern over the fact that it might replace a lot of the creative input. And I think that ultimately creators need to figure out how to use AI as a tool to make their own work product better, faster, and more efficient, while still retaining their personal creative component at the core of it. And I think there's ways that creators can do that. Otherwise, the risk is that studios will attempt to create story ideas and content whole cloth out of AI down the road. We probably aren't quite there yet with the technology that we have today, but I have no doubt that it's coming. So creators have to figure out how to use AI as a tool to make their work better, because the human component, to me, will always be necessary for something that's truly extraordinary. So my message there is, let's figure out how to make AI work for us rather than trying to compete with it head on. And don't ask me any follow-up questions, because I don't have any good answers on that, as I'm not an AI expert. Other trends. Look, let me start by saying something that's not a trend. It's an anti-trend. And I really want to say this on this podcast, because sometimes we can all feel a bit of doom and gloom about all this. But storytelling is universal. Storytelling has always been universal. Storytelling has existed since the dawn of human history. Since before we had written history, stories were how we passed down information. As my friend Lynn Ferguson, who's a good Scotswoman, says, story is about it's about lessons and warnings. There's fish in the river. There's there's a bear in those woods. You know, that's how you teach. That's how you pass on information from generations to generation. And people respond to story. People respond to information communicated via story much better than they just respond to a piece of dry information. It is part of what makes us human. It's part of how our psyche is wired, is responding to a well-told story. It will always be there. So when we talk about the ups and downs of the creative industries, it's important to remember that demand, the hunger, the appetite will always exist. And it's just a question of the business side getting the business models right. And we go through ups and downs of this. But, you know, look at the Great Depression in the United States. One of the most popular things that people could do affordably was go to the movies. At a time when they were struggling and every other front of their lives, and they still went to the movies. Movies were more popular than, I don't have the statistics, and someone fact check me, but I think movies were more popular than ever during the 1930s. So storytelling will not go away. So I think that therefore this industry will not go away. So we just kind of have to figure it out. Right now, I think animation is working really well. Something like 40% of US box office last year was animated content. I don't know if we're counting Wicked or not on that 40%. It's not technically animated. We might be counting Wicked in that, but it's the biggest proportion. I don't know if it's the biggest proportion ever, but it's the biggest proportion in a very long time, and it's been trending upwards. Huge number of animated films were among the top box office draws last year. You know, Inside Out 2. You know, the new Wallace and Gromit film, Moana 2, and so on. And on television, you know, we have the Bluey phenomenon, which is streaming content. And we have our own content at Two Daughters Entertainment that we're very proud of. The Moli series is available on Boomerang and Peacock and Youku in China. It's available in 180 countries, 30 languages. And so I'm very pleased to be working in the animation space because I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that parents will always want to share stories with their kids that will, you know, entertain them, teach them values, and help them learn about the world. And you know, that's part of that storytelling constant that I just spoke about. I think is family entertainment is looking really, really solid right now. So I think that's, you know, I think that's a healthy part of the industry. In terms of other trends, you know, we spoke earlier about production budgets need to come down. And, you know, again, we like to criticize AI, but hopefully that AI is going to help on that front. You know, if your VFX budget can be cut in half but still achieve the same results, if your virtual production costs are continually coming down, and they are, that hopefully will translate into a smaller production budgets that will enable more content to be made, and restore some of the jobs that people are worried about.
Wow, Carlo, that was a very, very good answer overall. That covered a lots of stuff. I don't even know how to respond, to be fair. But I really liked what you said about storytelling never changing, though. I think as an anti-trend, it's important. I think we get too obsessed sometimes by where we're at, and it's hard when you're in it to step back and remember that. So I think it's an important reminder for sure. I guess I want to follow up very quickly, actually. What do you think animation, since you're working quite closely in that just now, is there anything the rest of the industry could learn from the animation space?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. I think animation does timelessness really well. So when we talk about timeless storytelling, I mean, you think about some of the animated films of the past 30, 40 years, many of them don't feel very dated at all. Whereas if you look at some of the movies that you might have loved in the 80s or 90s, if you're old enough, and you try to watch them today, you might look at them and go, wow, that is not how I remember that film at all. But I think there's a timeless, because, you know, there's a fairy tale quality to these things. They're not, for the most part, tied to a specific time and place. There's a long tail on a lot of animated content. It's, you know, you can watch it many, many times and so forth. So timeless storytelling is kind of a creative lesson that you can take away from the animation space. in terms of other lessons, I think animation, and we're doing this at Two Daughters Entertainment, by the way, is an area where also production budgets also need to come down. And at Two Daughters, part of our core business model is making content for a lot less money than some of our competitors are making it, and keeping those production costs in control. And we've done that by working with certain animation studios, but we've also done that by controlling our corporate overheads. We're extremely lean company. We don't employ a lot of people. We don't spend a lot of money on things that aren't strictly necessary, and that puts the content development and production first. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but those are my initial thoughts.
No, for sure, it's really interesting. I was thought of it there, and something I didn't think to ask before, but I think it's just always interesting to see how different sectors can learn from each other and things like that, especially given your sort of current role and expertise and stuff. I also want to ask as well, quite a big question, might be harder to answer, but what's the biggest lesson you've learned in your career so far, which I know has spanned many different areas?
I've probably touched on them already in this conversation. Except for lessons that I learned managing people when I was working at the British Consulate, which is a whole other topic of conversation that could probably keep us busy for another hour. I would say the importance of relationships is one thing. The importance of being the sort of person that does exactly what they say they're going to do and follows through on what they say they're going to follow through on, I think is hugely important. It helps cut through the noise a lot of times because the industry is full of so many people who don't do that. I'm not claiming perfection in this area. I don't think anybody is absolutely perfect. But if you make your best effort, I think that's really important. I don't know. I don't know what else I could tell you right now, because I think we basically touched on a lot of it already.
No, great. No, so many brilliant things in this episode so far for people to take away, for sure. I suppose the other thing which I ask everyone that comes on this show this, but how do you protect your mental health, especially you run a separate business at the weekend and on top of your day job as well, like with PageCraft, which I know you've really enjoyed and it fills you up and stuff. But how do you protect your mental health in quite a busy industry where there's often lots of money involved and risk attached and all that as well?
That's a really hard question to answer, and I may not be the best person to answer it. You should have my wife on at some point. She recently took up a meditation class and swears that it's doing wonders for her. I'm not a meditator myself, but I've seen the positive effects in her, so maybe I should take it up. In terms of my mental health, I tend to, and basically this was a gift of the pandemic, because prior to that, I worked set hours, had to be at a desk for 8-9 hours a day, 10 hours sometimes if things were, we had a visiting minister, things were all hands on deck and you were working 14-hour days. But the gift of the pandemic is that when you were working from home, and now that I'm also working from home because I'm Two Daughters Entertainment's only U.S. employee, we do have a PR rep and a talent management company, but I'm the only sort of person in the U.S. with Two Daughters on the business card. I'm working from home, and that gives me a lot of flexibility in how I allocate my time, and I find that incredibly helpful. Because if I need to go to the vet or the grocery store in the middle of the day, then I do it. If I feel like jumping on my computer and doing emails for an hour after my wife has gone to bed, she goes to bed very early, then I do that. And I do that, and I know that I'm not going to wake up in the morning in quite so many emails, so I'm not as stressed when I wake up. I tend to have a very sort of fluid approach, and I think everyone is wired a little bit differently. So I don't think anything of pulling out my phone and doing 15 minutes of work right before dinner or whatever it is. I stay on top of the flow, but I also don't think anything of taking a break in the middle of the day because there's something I need to go and take care of. And when I sit there, I don't do this very often because I believe in counting productivity rather than hours. But when I do think about my hours, I think yeah, I think, A, I'm more productive, and B, yeah, I am putting in about the hours that I say or I should be putting in. So it all sort of works out well. Um, I also think that it's incredibly important to be able to just step away when you step away. The times where I'm feeling most mentally unhealthy is when I can't turn off the pressure of something went wrong or something still needs to be done, sort of buzzing in your ear. It's incredibly important to be able to just set it aside. And that's easier said than done, but particularly when something really is important is looming. But if you can find ways to unplug yourself, whether it's a piece of content that you love on television or a meditation or going for an hour-long walk with the dog, which I do, I think it's important to be able to do.
For sure. No, thank you very much, Carl. Yeah. A really good answer, and I appreciate your honesty. And yeah, I completely agree about counting productivity more than hours. I think we lose a lot of value in doing that sometimes. Last question for you, and honestly, it's been so nice chatting to you tonight. You covered lots of interesting areas which I've not talked about on the podcast before, and it's really interesting to get your sort of perspective on things, so I appreciate it a lot. But my last question for you is just, is there anything good that you've watched recently, or any content really that you'd seen that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I just watched the season 2 finale of Severance. I love that show. That is a wonderful show. It is unlike any show I've ever seen before. Look, I mean, we teach screenwriting, and I've seen a lot of content, so it isn't often that I'm surprised by something. So I love it when I am. And Severance it always keeps you guessing. So that's really great. I love that about that show. What else have I watched recently that I've loved? I love Hacks. If you've seen that, that's a great show. I think they've done 3 seasons of that. I just watched an Italian miniseries. I speak Italian, but it's subtitled, called The Leopard. That was interesting. It didn't end in a way that content typically ends. It just kind of ambiguously sort of stops. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching the period costumes and the commentary on a certain period of Italian history. So that was really good. And I watch a lot of black comedy as well. We're currently watching the latest season of Mythic Quest, which is, a funny show. God, what else have I loved? I mean, my favorite film from last year was my top films from last year were probably animated. I love The Wild Robot. I loved Flow. In terms of non-animated content last year, A Complete Unknown, Conclave, Substance was really interesting. Those were some of my favorite films of last year.
I've given lots of recommendations. I need to get on the Severance bandwagon. I watched the pilot like a year ago and really liked it, but I don't have Apple at the moment, so I need to just get Apple and watch it, I think, because you're not the first person to tell me to watch it, so there are lots of it. But Carlo, thank you very, very much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I've loved chatting to you, so thank you. I'll let you get on with your day, because I know it's the middle of the day over where you are, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the time, and it was great chatting with you.